Good evening, everybody, and welcome to another London lecture in the series Remembering and Forgetting, brought to you by the Royal Institute of Philosophy. Now, it's a great pleasure to introduce our speaker for this evening, Kathy Puddifoot, from the University of Durham. She's an associate professor in the Department of Philosophy there. She has interests in social epistemology, feminist epistemology, and the philosophy of psychology. She's written a large number of articles on those subjects, and her book, How Stereotypes Deceive Us, came out with OUP in 2021. And her talk this evening is called, Can Memories Be Unjust? Can Acts of Remembering Be Unjust? Kathy, over to you.
Thank you very much. Thanks for coming, everyone. So yeah, my title has got longer. It was initially, Can Memories Be Unjust? But as I was writing my slides out, I actually thought, maybe really what I have is two questions here, which initially seemed to only be one. So the title expanded to be, Can Memories Be Unjust? Can Acts of Remembering Be Unjust? Okay, so just to get you thinking about this topic, I want you to think about the sorts of things that you normally take to be unjust, or the sorts of things that could potentially be unjust, and the sorts of things you might debate with your friends perhaps about whether or not they're unjust. So when you start thinking about this question, you might think about rules. Perhaps if you're in school, you might be more likely to think about rules, laws, policies. So we've got a couple of examples of policies that people have taken to be unjust. You might or might not agree with their evaluations, but it might be something you would debate whether or not these things are unjust. You might think the distribution of wealth is unjust. The idea that you've got some people who have really high levels of wealth and some people living in significant poverty, that this could be unjust, or at least it's something that you might debate whether or not it's unjust. The distribution of other goods. You might also think that these other goods, things like education, the distribution of those things could be unjust. And maybe you think your parents, or someone might think parents are unjust. This is something I hear from my small children sometimes. But I want to argue that when you're thinking about what might be unjust, you should also consider memories as a category of things that could also be unjust, and where you need to think about, in any individual case, whether the memory is unjust. But I'm also going to argue that acts of remembering can't be. And this is, I think, like an interesting move. I hope you agree. Because you might think that memories and acts of remembering are kind of like the same thing, that it's interchangeable, but I'm going to argue that this actually isn't the case. Or more precisely, we shouldn't conceive of remembering in such a way that acts of remembering can count as unjust. Okay, so why have we got this picture? This is a picture of a beach in Lowestoft. Anyone from Lowestoft? Very unlikely. I actually gave this talk the other day to someone and they came up and said they had very fond memories of Lowestoft. The reason I've chosen Lowestoft is because I spent a good amount of my childhood. You could say I grew up in Lowestoft. This is a beach here. So I have various recollections of growing up in Lowestoft. One example of this would be my recollection of learning to swim in the sea in Lowestoft. I'm not sure that's something we do nowadays. It's something that I did, though. This recollection that I have is of a particular episode in my personal past, something that happened to me. So this would be counted in philosophy and psychology and related disciplines as an episodic memory. And it's these sorts of things, that recollections that people have of episodes in their personal past, that I'm going to argue can be unjust. And that might seem to you slightly puzzling. You might think if it's like a personal thought that you have or a belief you have about your own past, that's not the sort of thing that can be unjust. It's very different to like a government policy, for example. But I'm going to argue that, in fact, these things can be. So my sort of inspiration for this move that I think that we should make is a literature that's really quite vast now on the way that stereotypes shape how we recollect the past. So there's this really long established literature from throughout the 20th century and into the 21st century, establishing that what we recollect about the past is often shaped by social stereotypes that we harbour, social schemas. There's another way to think about them. So there are actually various different directions that this can go. So it seems like if you're operating under conditions of stress, or you've got a high level of cognitive load, you're trying to process quite a lot of information, and you're making a judgment about someone who's of a particular gender or racial minority group, you're particularly likely to remember their behaviour in a way that's stereotypical. So what this means is that you're more likely to recall those behaviours that they display that are fitting with a stereotype, and less likely to recall those behaviours that are not fitting with a stereotype. And also, you might fill out the gaps in your memories of the past in ways that are stereotypical. So an example might help. An example usually helps. So say that you're thinking about, this is always useful, I don't get all self-conscious when I do this. Imagine you're thinking about this talk later, right? So you're recollecting what happened when I was speaking. Say that as part of what happens in this talk, I sort of accidentally spill my drink. It's something I'm kind of known for doing. And you have a stereotype of philosophers as clumsy. So that behaviour fits with the stereotype you have of philosophers as clumsy, maybe absent-minded. But I do all sorts of other things that don't fit with your stereotype of a philosopher. Perhaps I show really good knowledge of science, something like this. The idea is that there's all this literature from sociology, from Halbrax, and from psychology, from Bartlett, and from social psychologists, including Susan Fiske, and neuroscientists right now are doing work on this, establishing that, in fact, when you are thinking back to this talk, it's quite likely, depending on the conditions, that you will do that you'll recall my behaviour in a way that's fitting with the stereotype of a philosopher, as long as you see me as a philosopher and as a genuine philosopher, which is another topic, but a topic for another day. But I think that these findings are really interesting because they suggest that people can, on some occasions, be wronged by other people's memory systems. So this is just one example, I think, of this effect, and a project I'm engaging in right now is to try and find other ways that people can be wronged by other people's memory systems. In this sort of case, it seems like the wrong happens because there can be a negative impact on the person whose behaviour is recalled in a biased way. So let's move away from the example of me, because I don't know how much I'm harmed by you remembering that I spill water but not something else. But let's take a sort of more tangible, practical example, one that I often appeal to. So imagine that there's a fight breaks out at a football match. You've got this altercation going on, and you've got a person who displays and is perceived by other people to be like a working class man who might look a bit like the stereotype of a hooligan, let's say. So when this altercation breaks out, this person is stood next to the altercation and just chatting with his father who he's brought to the football. So he could be chatting about the game, or he could be chatting about their week. This might be their one opportunity to talk all week or every fortnight about what's going on in their lives. But in any case, what this person's doing is very innocent and wholesome. But this altercation breaks out, and when it happens, someone comes hurtling in the direction of this person. We'll call them Matt. Matt's elderly father. So Matt intervenes to just protect his father and push the person who's hurtling in the direction of his father away. But someone is watching this, there's an eyewitness to this, and they harbour a stereotype associating working class men in the context of football as hooligans, and therefore, when they see this behaviour, they falsely remember that this person acted in an aggressive way. Now, you can fill out the details of this example in whatever way you like, so you can input any aspect of a person's social identity that might lead them to be stereotypes in a negative way, such that they would be displaying behaviour that would be deemed to be negative when they really didn't display that behaviour. And then you find that there can be significant harms of various types that philosophers are interested in talking about. So there's this body of work that's been developed recently on affective injustice, looking at the way that people are harmed in their capacity to have feelings and emotions. The idea being, roughly, although the details are really rich and interesting, that we have a sort of right to subjective well-being and to the expression of our emotions where they're apt. You might think that in this sort of situation, the person is wronged in that capacity, or at least significantly harmed as an affective being. So if you have this sort of accusation made against you that's false, you're falsely accused of engaging in aggressive behaviour when you didn't, that could cause stress and anxiety. If this happens to you over time, if you have an accumulation of different experiences of this type, then that could lead you to have a significant damage to your mental health. So there can be a negative impact on people's emotions and their well-being as a result of these sorts of memories, these sorts of recollections that are biased in these ways. It also seems like you have something that's a lot like, perhaps as an instance of what Miranda Fricker calls epistemic injustice. So Fricker talks about cases where people are wronged in their capacity as knowers. So we all have the ability to gain knowledge, produce knowledge, communicate knowledge. But sometimes some people are wronged in that capacity. I think that actually in this sort of situation, you could very easily have something similar. So somebody misremembers, they don't properly recall your behaviour, they recall your behaviour as more stereotypical than it is. Say that you then try to provide your version of events. You try to say what you really did. If you're in this situation where someone else's recollection is biased and they're saying the opposite, then you might be discounted and not taken seriously when you provide an account. I think there are other ways people can experience similar sorts of harms too. But also, it seems clear that if somebody falsely recalls your behaviour in this type of way, this can limit your capacity to achieve practical goals. So if we return to Matt, so Matt might just simply, and you might think not very seriously, be banned from future football games. So you might think that's not a serious harm. It could actually be a really significant harm if this is the one opportunity to bond with his father and speak about things in a fortnight. But it could also be that this sort of event gets escalated to like the legal system and there are criminal proceedings. In that sort of case, somebody could be wrongly charged because of the result of someone else's false recollections of their behaviour. So there can be significant practical harms, it seems, too. So I think you have this combination of different harms that people face the risk of when other people falsely recall their behaviour in line with the stereotype. On top of this, I think that when you have this sort of false recollection of someone's behaviour, this prevents people's autonomous choices and their individuality from being given recognition. So in this example, you have this person, Matt, who has made a choice about how to conduct himself. So he's decided to peacefully attend this match, use it as an opportunity to bond and speak carefully with his father, and he has decided not to engage in any altercation and instead just protect his father. So in this scenario, there are various different expressions of his agency, choices that he makes. But when the eyewitness recalls his behaviour in a way that is false, these expressions of agency are missed. So there's a lack of recognition. And you can think of this on like a personal level, if you can try and think of an occasion where it seems like someone has misremembered your behaviour, how that might have made you feel, how it might have made you feel frustrated. You know, you made a choice, you acted in a certain way, but they're not remembering your behaviour in that way. On top of this, it seems like in this example, Matt is making a choice to act in a certain way as an individual, and this isn't at all reflective of like his group membership, his working class status. He's making a decision, he's acting in a certain way as an individual, but that individuality isn't given true recognition if his behaviour is recalled in a way that is stereotypical, because then he's being remembered, well, not remembered I'm going to say, but recalled as behaving in a way in virtue of his social identity. Really importantly, I think, is often those people who are most marginalised in society who are likely to be the people who have their behaviours recalled in a false way, because stereotypes are most likely to be around relating to them, but also because it seems like those stereotypes that are most commonly held in society, gender and race ones, for example, are most likely to lead people to recall the past in a biased way. So there's an uneven distribution of risk here of these things I've just described. So you have an uneven distribution of risk of harm, lack of respect for individuality and autonomy, and I think an uneven risk of being demeaned. So I think if your behaviour is recalled in this way that's stereotypical and your autonomous choices are not given recognition, that there's a sense in which this is demeaning to you, lacking respect for you and your choices. So in response to this sort of case, I've introduced the term mnemonic injustice. So I think that it's really important to give a label to this stuff, identify it as what it is, a case where people are treated unjustly in virtue of the operation of someone else's memory systems. Memories can be unjust because they produce mnemonic injustice. Okay, so that's the first stage of the argument. I'm hoping you're with me this far. But I also want to argue that acts of remembering cannot be or should not be unjust. More precisely, I want to argue that we shouldn't treat unjust memories, like the memories I was just describing there, as acts of remembering. At least if we're concerned with being just and fair and creating a more just and fair world, we should aim to treat memories as not acts of remembering whenever treating them as acts of remembering could cause or compound injustice. So I think that sometimes viewing an act of remembering, a memory as an act of remembering gives it a form of authority that we don't want to be giving to these unjust memories. So hopefully things will become clearer. So the idea then that I need to convince you of first is that if you treat something as an act of remembering rather than a mere memory, then what this does is it gives it authority, okay? You view my recollection of what happened yesterday as an act of remembering. That involves treating me as an authority with respect to the past. So why might you think this? Well, first of all, you might think, philosophers think this, okay? So here are a number of philosophers, prominent names in philosophy, particularly in the 20th century. They endorsed what was called an epistemic theory of memory. So on this view of what it is to remember, you remember if you know about the past and you previously knew about the past. So remembering is knowing. So here we've got Robert Audi. If you remember that we met, you know that we did. Similarly, if you remember me, you know me. Norman Malcolm, a person B remembers that P if and only if B knows that P because he knew that P. Michael Dummett, memory is not a source, still less a ground of knowledge. It is a maintenance of knowledge formerly acquired by whatever means. So on all of these views, if you remember something, you know it, right? And if you know something, then it seems like that involves being an authority, someone who's trustworthy in relation to that thing that you know about. So if you know that something happened yesterday, if you know that that person was aggressive in their football match, then it seems as if you are an authority and can be trusted with respect to that thing. And for these people, remembering just is knowing. So it seems like, at least if you're with the philosophers, there's reason to think that when you view something as an act of remembering, you view it as knowledge and you view it as the sort of thing that should be trusted. But you might think that the philosophers have likely got things wrong, and ultimately I don't agree with their view of what it is to remember. So you might say, okay, so philosophers think that remembering is knowing, and so when philosophers, at least these particular ones, see someone as remembering, they would see them as knowing, but ordinarily we don't do this. But actually I think that there are various different reasons for thinking that this is right. That when we view someone to be remembering, when we conceptualize them as remembering, we are also treating them as trustworthy in relation to the thing that we're taking them to remember. One source of evidence in support of this is evidence about eyewitnesses and the responses that they get from jurors and fact finders in trials. So there's evidence suggesting that people find the testimony given by eyewitnesses to be really compelling, even when they shouldn't, even when there's like DNA evidence that would be better evidence. They'll still trust the eyewitness testimony. If that's right, I think it gives us some reason for thinking that when people view other people as remembering the past, they're really willing to trust them on that, okay? I also think that if you look at the language, it seems like it could just be contradictory to talk about people falsely remembering. I don't know if that's an intuition that you have, but I don't know whether you would talk about someone falsely remembering. Compare that to false memory. So it seems like in a lot of cases, we might be willing to say that someone is having a false memory. Sue Campbell argues that this is the result of debates over women's claims to have been abused as children, and that the idea of false memory arose in response to that to discredit the people who were making those claims. But whatever the story, it still seems to me that where we'd be willing to say that people can have a false memory, we're less willing to say that they can falsely remember. And that, I think, suggests that when we view someone as remembering, we still view them as having a form of authority and being trustworthy. Another whole body of work that's come out recently, including some work by me, focuses on the way that stripping people of the status of rememberer, treating people as if they can't remember, perhaps because of their gender, perhaps because they have a certain mental health condition or some other sort of medical condition. Stripping the status of rememberer, treating people as if they can't remember, is a good way to undermine their authority. So it seems then that there's a sort of correspondence between viewing people as rememberers and viewing them as trustworthy, as the sorts of individuals that should be trusted. And when they articulate claims about the past, those claims are treated as trustworthy. So if this is all right, then it seems like remembering is what philosophers call a thick concept. So it's descriptive, it's describing what someone's doing. When you say someone's remembering, you're sort of describing something about their psychology, that they have like a belief about the past, maybe. But it's also prescriptive in some sense. If you treat someone as remembering, you treat them as a sort of individual that can be trusted in relation to something. You give them a sort of authority. You treat them as someone who knows about that thing that you take them to be remembering. So if this is right, then I think treating people as remembering in these cases where memories are unjust could actually cause or compound injustice. So say you have a situation where you are listening to the testimony of the eyewitness who made the false claims about Matt's behaviour at the football. Say in that situation, rather than questioning the eyewitness, you treat her as a rememberer. You give her the authority that you normally give to people who you believe to be remembering something. I think giving that authority, treating that person as a remember, can worsen the situation of Matt, create further injustice for him. It could worsen the impact on his feelings, so if he's aware that you are treating this eyewitness as someone who's trustworthy, when she's making an accusation against him about being aggressive when he wasn't, then that could make him feel really bad. But if this happens systematically over time and people are making false claims about your behaviour and they are being believed, that could again really significantly, I think, damage your mental health, increases your levels of stress and anxiety. There could be practical harms associated with this. So we're going to be very specific here and imagine that you are the person who's in charge of who gets into that football ground in the future. So you are that individual, you're listening to the eyewitness who says, Matt was aggressive, probably not using Matt's name, but using some sort of descriptive term. If you believe that eyewitness, if you treat them as genuinely remembering and you trust them, then that could have the practical harm of at the minimum, preventing Matt from being allowed back to future games. But you can imagine that in other settings like the courtroom, there could be even more significant, really significant harms to someone. If an eyewitness makes a false claim about someone on the basis of a stereotype shaping how they recall the person's behaviour, then that person could suffer really significant negative consequences. And also, by trusting the person who's making the false allegation because they're falsely recalling this episode, by treating them as a rememberer and giving them that authority, you're sort of denying authority to the person whose behaviour is being recalled in a false way. So if you trust this eyewitness, if you treat them as genuinely remembering and give them the sort of credibility that it seems jurors do eyewitnesses all of the time, then there's a sense in which you are stripping authority from Matt whilst Matt is providing a defence of his own behaviour and explaining that he didn't behave in the way he's accused. But also this could happen in lots of different scenarios. But on the flip side of this, if you deny that the person who is recalling the past in this stereotypical way is remembering, it seems like you can do all sorts of positive things. So you deny this eyewitness genuinely remembers that Matt was aggressive. This could provide really good emotional support for Matt or whoever we fit into this scenario. It could reduce their distress. Okay, so someone seems to be misremembering your behaviour. They're recalling your behaviour in an inaccurate way. Somebody says to you, look, I don't believe that they remember. I'm not going to treat them as a rememberer. That could, I think, alleviate some of your stress and anxiety and reduce impact on your mental health. Could also reduce practical harm. So if you treat an eyewitness as if they're not really remembering, as if they're having a false memory perhaps, or a memory that you're not quite willing to give the status of remembering anyway, you're not willing to give that level of authority, then that could reduce practical harms. So if you are that juror in a courtroom, for example, by treating someone who's making a false claim as not remembering, you could then be really decisive in someone being acquitted when they should be. On top of that, by saying, I don't really think that eyewitness is remembering, you can provide a sort of validation to the person whose behaviour is being recalled in a biased way, where they're being recalled as being more stereotypical than they really were. So then I think this concept, remember, this word remember, these ideas of remember and remembering can actually be a really useful tool in the fight for justice. If we conceptualize remembering in a way that allows us to strip authority from these unjust memories, then it seems, I think, that we could make real progress towards improving outcomes for people who might otherwise be stereotyped and treated as if they behaved in stereotypical ways. So it's difficult to think of how this might happen, okay? And I'm often asked, practically, really, what's this going to mean? But I think there are contexts in which we could encourage the concept of remembering to be used in a certain way that would help achieve positive results. So, for example, you might have courtroom instructions to jurors who are making decisions about whether or not someone's innocent or guilty. We say, only treat someone as remembering if, and you could stipulate what should fit in after that if in a way that fits with these sorts of ideas and reflects how memories can be unjust and tries to prevent jurors from treating those unjust memories with authority by treating them as acts of remembering. And another sort of context would be human resources decision making. You can see how decisions about hiring and firing and promotion could be heavily influenced by people's recollections of their colleagues' contributions in the workplace, for example. So that's a sort of place where stereotypes could come in people's recollections of the past, and this could have a significant impact on people's outcomes. It could prevent them from being hired or promoted when it would be right for them to be hired or promoted. So I think you could build this sort of stuff into human resources, decision-making processes, these sorts of instructions. I actually think there's a really interesting example where this sort of thing is already done to some extent, which is in the instructions that are given to people who are making judgments about claims for asylum. So in the guidance that's given to caseworkers for asylum claims, it's stipulated that people sometimes recall the past in ways that involve some inconsistency and error, but nonetheless you can treat them as reliable with respect to their accounts, even though they're making those errors. I think something similar to what I'm describing here is going on there as a sort of way of saying these people could remember what they're claiming. It could be a genuine memory that they're articulating, even though what they say might involve some inconsistency or error. Okay, so I think that this concept of remembering, because it has this associated authority, can be used to strip authority from unjust memories, producing all sorts of positive results, if it's sort of adjusted and changed so the concept of remembering is only applied when it supports justice and fairness, which wouldn't include in these sorts of cases where people are stereotyping and it seems like their memories are unjust. Okay then, so I think that there is a challenge for philosophers, potentially others, that comes out of this work, which is to develop a conceptualization of what it is to remember that ensures that people and groups perhaps are only described as remembering and given the associated authority when this supports justice and fairness. And I've looked at and described here a few cases where the opposite would be true. But you might think, like, there's a really simple answer to this question, right? So you might think that what we need is people to only treat other people as remembering when their beliefs about the past are accurate, okay? So you might think, people have false memories, and that's fine. We don't want to say false memories are acts of remembering, but maybe we could just say that all memories that are accurate, they should be treated as acts of remembering. Okay, so why can't we make this simple move? Just say that, if a memory is inaccurate, then it's not an act of remembering. Well, the problem with this is that if you look at the psychology and broader cognitive science and also social sciences around memory, there's reason to think that many, if not most, of the memories that we have of the past, the sorts of things that we would probably want to treat as acts of remembering, have some element of inaccuracy. So the reason that we have to think this is because there's very strong reasons for thinking that memory is constructive or reconstructive. So, you might or might not, and in fact it seems like a lot of people don't think this way, even though it's easy to cast them as if they do. You might think that memory acts by you storing away files of information, like you might do in a Word document, which you can retrieve later exactly as you put it in. But this isn't how most people now think that memory works. Instead, memory involves a process of construction where, when you retrieve, where that's used kind of loosely, memory from your memory system, there's an element of construction. So you construct a plausible representation of the past from traces of information that you've got stored away. Now, this process of construction can be really useful, right? We navigate the world fairly well based on what we remember from the past. So in a lot of the cases, it seems like things go well, but it also means that there's always the potential for inaccuracies to creep in when we remember the past. And here's an example of how that might happen. I have no idea if this is useful, but I want to talk about it anyway. So I have 2 children. They are 5 and 8. Imagine I am talking to my 5-year-old about when we recently went to the Kung Fu Panda movie. This isn't so recent anymore, but I'm talking to him and I'm saying, do you remember when that thing happened? Do you remember when we, I'm going to do another spilling example, when we bought the popcorn and spilt it on the floor, something like that. So I'm talking to this child about this episode from the past, but my partner's looking at me and going, oh no, don't say that. And then it dawns on me that I didn't actually take the 5-year-old to see this movie, although he really wanted to see it. I took him and his brother, both of them, to see the Puss in Boots movie. And what I've done in recalling this episode with the popcorn is I've combined pieces of information about the 2 events. So I've combined information about going to see Puss in Boots with the younger child with information about going to see Kung Fu Panda. I actually have no recollection of either of the movies. Not a great fan. But this would be an example of how the construction process, where you construct a representation of the past, can go wrong. And it's fairly widely accepted that this very often happens when we recall the past. So it seems like if we were to say, as a blanket thing, if there's any inaccuracy in a memory, then we don't want to treat it as remembering or trustworthy, then we might end up in a really skeptical position where we just can't trust any of our memories. And it seems like most of us would want to avoid that. But there are also specific cases where it seems like we don't want to say that, a small amount of inaccuracy should undermine the authority of a memory. And here's a newly re-relevant example. So this is an example of Donald Trump's conduct. In response to an accusation made by Dr. Christine Blasey Ford against his nominee for the Supreme Court, Brett Kavanaugh. Okay, so Christine Blasey Ford made an accusation that 30 years in the past, she had been assaulted by this nominee for the Supreme Court. When she was questioned about this, though, she couldn't provide lots of details that were demanded of her. So here's Trump's response. "How did you get home?" Trump said, echoing a question Ford was asked by the committee. "I don't remember." "How did you get there?" "I don't remember." "Where is the place?" "I don't remember." "How many years ago was it?" "I don't know." "What neighbourhood was it?" "I don't know." "Where's the house?" "I don't know." He then went on to allege that she, Christine Blasey Ford, was part of a conspiracy of evil people. So here we have an example of someone making a claim about what happened to them in the past. We don't need to assume that what she's saying is true. To see that, we want to take it seriously as something that is potentially true. It seems like we shouldn't dismiss this recollection of the past and say that it's not trustworthy and shouldn't be treated as remembering at all just because Christine Blasey Ford couldn't remember how to get home from this party where she was allegedly assaulted 30 years previously. It seems like it's really important, especially if we want just outcomes, that people can make claims about traumatic episodes in their past that are treated as genuine acts of remembering and with authority, even though some of the details involved in the act of recollection are inaccuracy. If you look at the literature on stress and trauma, there's very good reason to think that this is a normal thing that happens. People are able to recall the core details of an event that they've experienced, but some of the peripheral details, and not the main details, get lost. Okay, so this seemingly simple move of just saying, well, we shouldn't treat with authority or as remembering any memory with any element of inaccuracy, I think has negative results and isn't a thing we should really consider. So then, I think we can sort of sharpen up this challenge that I think is there for philosophers, and I'm trying to actually work on a book that I am, in theory, writing at the moment, to develop a conceptualization of remembering that ensures that people and groups are only described as remembering if the inaccuracy that's involved in their memory of the past is consistent with justice and fairness. So, if it's the case that someone is providing an account of something that happened to them in the past when they were assaulted, and some of the details are inaccurate, but there seems to be good reason to think that there are sufficient details there that are right to make the judgment that the person they're accusing is guilty, then it's okay to treat that recollection as an act of remembering. But in a case where someone inaccurately recalls that someone was aggressive due to a stereotype relating to their social identity, that it isn't consistent with justice to treat that with authority. And so I think we should work on aiming to conceptualize remembering in a way that means that those sorts of cases don't get treated with authority. Okay, so maybe this will be helpful. I want to argue then that memories can be unjust, and hopefully you're convinced of this, but we should aim for a situation where acts of remembering can't be unjust, because those memories that are unjust are not treated as acts of remembering, because treating them as acts of remembering involves giving them a sort of authority that we don't want to give them. So we should aim to think about what it is to remember in a way that means that those unjust memories aren't treated as acts of remembering and are instead stripped of authority. So I think that if we do this, if we start thinking of what it is to remember in this sort of way, develop this sort of nuanced view of what it is to remember that has social justice goals in mind, there's the potential to reduce injustice rather than compound it, where if you have a situation where people are treated as rememberers when they're unjustly having these memories that are false about the past, then this might cause or compound injustice. So I think that there's a challenge here for those who want to take it up. Maybe I'm the only one, which is to develop a conceptualization of what it is to remember that reduces injustice. Thank you for listening.
Hi there, thank you for a really fascinating talk, really thought-provoking, and I think applicable to lots of topics going on at the moment. I'm really interested in your perspective on what extent do you think that these unjust acts of remembering or false memories can be applied to oneself. And I'm thinking specifically around women in the workplace, imposter syndrome, and the effects of gender or ethnic backgrounds on how we perceive imposter syndrome or imposter phenomenon.
I absolutely think that is something that can happen, and it's something that we should be concerned about. And I think that it possibly is positive for us to be engaging in the sort of reflection on whether or not we are like judging ourselves by fair standards, or whether or not we're, so in a way, you know, because in a way I worry about it a little bit, because it's like increasing self-doubt in people who might already be experiencing self-doubt. But it can be viewed more positively, I think, too, as a form of like sort of like reassurance, or like uplifting people, encouraging people that, you know, maybe when you're thinking these things about yourself, you're thinking these things for reasons that aren't good ones, and that maybe actually giving these thoughts a sort of authority is not the right thing. It's not just towards yourself. I wouldn't have any problem with that. I don't think that you need to think of like injustice as like blameworthy, so it wouldn't necessarily bring any element of blame. So I think there can be like a wrongdoing towards oneself if you're harming yourself, without it therefore being something that you should be blamed for or held culpable for. Thanks for the question.
Hi, thank you. That was really interesting. I was wondering whether it always has to be injustice in terms of sort of identity groups. Thinking of a case where maybe you're like a sort of really badly behaved child at school, and then you sort of, you're turning over a new leaf, you sort of shake off that label, but people are still sort of applying it to you and seeing sort of small slip-ups in that same way. And then I'm thinking, if injustice can sort of apply on the personal level, does it become harder to distinguish between the cases where you have the so we don't want to say it's sort of circumstantial inaccuracies that aren't relevant to the main gist, but then maybe we need the sort of group characterization to think about what serves justice and fairness rather than just accuracy.
Yeah, no, it's another really good question. So I really waver on this, okay. But I think that what this framework gives you is a way to evaluate the harm that happens in those sorts of cases where you're just looking at an individual and it's not related to their social identity, even if you don't want to go as far as saying that there's an injustice. I think probably in that sort of case that there could at least be an injustice. And part of what I want to say is it's going to depend on other vulnerabilities that the person might be experiencing. So yeah, if someone is a member of like, is vulnerable, but they have behaved badly in the past. So when they're like falsely recalled to have behaved badly, it's not because of their, like say, coming from a background of poverty, it's because of their actual behaviours. Their vulnerability in light of those aspects of their identity can mean that there's more harm involved in falsely recalling their behaviour, and it could rise to the level of injustice. I think in those sorts of cases, you're going to find a lot of the similar sorts of characteristics. So like the failure to respect someone's autonomy or their individuality, and the way that they've expressed their agency by making changes in their behaviour. I think all of those things seem to be really unjust. And then there's a question of whether you think we really lose anything by allowing those things into the category of unjust memories, mnemonic injustices. I'm not sure we do. But these are the sorts of questions I'm really interested in exploring, and I'd love other people to. So I have other work on the way that fear generalizes in response to traumatic events. So the idea that some people sometimes have a traumatic event and they have fear that generalizes. And in that work, I argue that the generalization of the fear can be unjust to those people who are the objects of fear, but also to people around the person who's experiencing the fear. This is work with Marina Trakas, so I should say we talk about the case of someone whose mother has experienced sexual assault and so displays overprotective behaviour towards them. They're vulnerable already because their mother has experienced this thing, and they are then harmed further through their overprotective behaviour, that's not an aspect of their social identity necessarily that makes it the case that they're harmed, but we still want to say that there's an injustice there, in large part because of the existing vulnerabilities. So some of those sorts of cases you're describing, I think, could fit under that sort of framing of mnemonic injustice.
I imagine this kind of research is useful for in the system of justice, like criminal investigating criminal cases or allegations. How easy or not easy is it to actually incorporate this like new research and knowledge into this quite conservative and rigid systems? Do you know?
Yeah, I mean, so I think there are difficulties, but if you actually look at the guidance that's given within the courtroom, there are instructions to people who are making decisions within the courtroom setting about how memory works and cognitive biases, and with the suggestion that it's important to take this sort of thing into consideration. So it's important to take into consideration that, you know, yeah, people can misremember in certain ways, but they can still like have information that's useful. There's also, though, a lot of sort of dialogue that's really heavily influenced by certain figures in these sorts of debates, who are often the sorts of figures who would be like perhaps arguing for the sorts of things that I wouldn't necessarily want to. So arguing, for example, that like claims to have been assaulted at a younger age are like likely to be unreliable because imagination and memory can get mixed up, which can mean that people falsely recall the past. And that's a sort of like discourse that at certain times in recent history has been really dominant in certain like thinking about the legal setting. So I think there definitely is room for this sort of discussion about these sorts of things to be put into practical action. I worry that so far the practical action's been the wrong sort, and it's been used, this sort of research on how memory is constructive has been used to undermine people's claims, where actually, in fact, it should be used to support claims, for example, in cases of assault and trauma. So short answer is, I think this sort of research really has been influential. It's been influential in the wrong sorts of ways. So ideally, I would like to be sort of pushing back against some of the discourse around memory. Whether or not I succeed as a philosopher, I will see. Come back to me in 10 years. Like,
I hope you will.
Oh, thank you.
Thanks very much. I suppose just building on that question, to do with the role of time, this is all to do with anything beyond the moment, from a minute ago, an hour ago, a week, a year, a decade. So I suppose the question is sort of how you frame that in terms of the accuracy of memories.
So how I frame it.
How I suppose, given what we're trying to achieve is a level of accuracy, or at least an understanding of what might be accurate and perhaps just or perhaps not. And I suppose the question is, how does that play out given the time, given we're talking about memories stored in a different way in the brain, a week, from a year to a decade? And I suppose, how does that play out into this?
Yeah, I mean, so I guess it seems right that we should be a little bit more skeptical of people's claims about like the distant past, but also it's going to depend on the context, right? So if something happened to you in the distant past that was really significant, then you might think actually it's very likely that you're going to remember it. And also if you're in contexts in which that recollection is likely to be triggered. So say that there's something that happened, like there's a story about my mum when we were playing a board game once, and I'm one of 5 siblings, and so like when we're all together, we all talk about like embarrassing stories from each other, including my mum. And there's this one story, I can really vividly recall this episode of this funny thing my mum did because we talk about it so often. It's part of our like rebonding when we get back together. So certain things like that will be the sorts of recollections that can be trusted and I think should be treated as acts of remembering because of like features that are local to them. But then you also have to factor in things like whether or not there the recollection was formed under conditions of stress and anxiety, those sorts of things. Because again, like if it seems like if you experience like a really traumatic event, then you're likely to store that information, the core information in relation to that really well, and might be likely to revisit it all of the time, which might make it more likely that you're gonna, those core details remember really well. So I don't think it's just a matter of time, right? It's a matter of lots of things, an interplay of lots of things. Something that happened to you 2 weeks ago but wasn't significant to you, which you haven't revisited since, then that might be something that should be treated as less authoritative than something that happened to you that you talk with your siblings about, if you have any, every time you meet. So there's a sense in which obviously our recollections degrade over time, but not all of them and not equally. And so we need to consider these sorts of things.
Got it. I suppose in the case of the football match, would it be more likely for the memory of that event to have been woven into some sort of narrative based on whatever the well, I can't remember your term for it, but effectively the bias of the person remembering? Is it likely that that bias would be more emphasis on that over a long period of time versus if they were remembering it from an hour ago?
I mean, I think this is really going to depend on the individual, right? So if you're the sort of person who engages in self-doubt, so we were talking about earlier about like how you might appropriately doubt your own memories, you might be the sort of person who questions this sort of thing, in which case you might become like less convinced that what you initially took yourself to see was what you actually saw. If you're someone who's like super confident in your initial interpretation, then you might not reinterpret or create a narrative around that event. But also there is the potential, of course, for people to create narratives, and it might also depend on other people, right? So who are you talking to about this? Other people's perspectives on events can shape your recollection, your narrative, your way of perceiving the past. So again, it's going to depend. I mean,
so the bias could be happening right at the moment. Their bias against Matt could be established right at that moment. So their memory is accurate. They're just biased.
Yeah, I would also in that case though classify the recollection as
Biased too.
Unjust. Yeah. Unjust and you might also say that the perception is unjust. There's a lot of work on that too, lots of interesting work on attention and injustice in philosophy. But I want to say that, you know, just as philosophers used to think that, you know, what you like remember is what you know now based on what you knew before, you can't disconnect the two. So if earlier on you perceived in a biased way and then you recall in a biased way, then that recollection is unjust. And like in terms of understanding the psychology and the solution to that, you're going to want to pinpoint where in time it happened. But in terms of dealing with the end product, that's less important.
Thank you. I think there's a lot of discussion, and the examples that you were providing were very like interpersonal and individual. I was wondering if you have any like how you envision, or if you envision your argument on a collective level with collective memory. So I'm thinking like particularly of communal recollection of like COVID, of war, of conflict, of trauma, and also how that plays into efforts for like reconciliation efforts. So things like Bosnia or South Africa, how memories and acts of remembering plays into justice in those collective examples.
Yeah, it's an excellent question again. So I would say what I've been trying to do is say that people have been focusing quite a lot on collective memories, and I want to do something sort of distinct and look at the interpersonal, individual level. But I understand that you can't really distinguish the two fully. So the collective memory is going to feed into individual memories and in the other direction. The way I'm seeing it now is that I'm interested in how like individuals recall the past, but that can be shaped by social structures and institutions. It can be shaped by like media narratives. It can be shaped by like methods of policing, things like this. Alessandro Tennessini has a really interesting paper talking about how political narratives shape individuals' recollections of the past by like presenting certain information and omitting other information that would seem to go together. And that could happen, for example, in the COVID case, if there's like, say you had politicians trying to like emphasize the success of the vaccine, but de-emphasize the situation with PPE. And they did it in such a way that they presented the information as if it would be encapsulating all that sort of relevant information about, like, I don't know, like innovation or technology around COVID. The omission of certain information can make people forget that that sort of thing happened, whilst at the same time emphasizing the stuff that the politician wants to emphasize. So there you've got a case where you've got like a portrayal, perhaps in the media or via other sources, on a sort of national potentially level, but that impacts the individual. And that's where I'm primarily interested right now when it comes to the more general stuff. But I mean, I have also got this paper looking at the asylum system and how people's experiences in the asylum system can lead them to experience stress and trauma that prevents them from recalling the past in a way that's convincing. So there you've got like a social structure and a set of government policies that are impacting someone and their ways of remembering, but without thinking about collective memory in the traditional sense. So, yeah.
Sorry, just a follow-up. I'm thinking specifically about your distinction between like a memory and an act of remembering and stripping of authority and giving authority. How would that particular aspect kind of play into collective memory? You know, how do you assert authority or distinguish between just and unjust in situations where collective memory or collective trauma is taking place, particularly when there's, you know, two competing groups or, you know, an oppressed and an oppressor in those types of situations?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a potential for this framework to be used quite effectively in those sorts of situations, in fact. It's not work that I've done, but I think that it could be done. So yeah, if you've got a case where there is a dominant narrative and it's being treated as like the collective remembering and treated as authoritative as such, then like sort of denying the status of remembering from that thing, saying, well, you know, this isn't something that should be trusted because perhaps it's a result of the narrative of the oppressor. That could be a way to go. It's not something I've thought much about. We can only do so much in our work, but I do think that there's a potential for this framework to be applied. Obviously, where there are competing narratives, things are going to be really difficult, but that's going to be the same on the individual level too. If you've got competing accounts of an individual event, it's going to be very difficult to determine how to respond to that and which to give authority to. But that's why I just think we need to give it more thought and look at the details, look at what really happens to individuals in cases like the ones we're examining.
I had a question in terms of how much do you think consequence has like a part to play in terms of how memory is collected? So in your example of Matt, let's say the person that he pushed off, like dislocated his shoulder, for example, and now there's like a really injured person, but technically it's his fault because he was in a fight. So how much do you think that recollection of due to the consequence of someone's being severely hurt, how much do you think that impacts the biases?
Yeah, so I think in that sort of case, even if the person who's pushed away is severely hurt, there's still an injustice if the recollection of the eyewitness is that Matt was aggressive. If the recollection is Matt pushed that person and they dislocated their shoulder, then that would be just, on my view, because there's no inaccuracy there that is unjust. But I think that because if you focus on the person, Matt in this case, there's still going to be a risk of harm that he faces in virtue of his working class identity. There's still going to be an extent to which his autonomous choice and his individuality isn't reflected in the recollection of his behaviour. So I still think it's going to be unjust, even if there's harm. Can you think of? I wonder if there's another case though where that's less convincing. That's along similar lines, where maybe if you think about like collective memory and that level of things, then at that level, the harm that's been done in the acts that are remembered or not remembered might determine whether or not there's injustice. So it is something I'll think more about.
Hello. I had a question on how much relevance affects this idea of conceptualizing what it is to remember. What I might consider being relevant may not necessarily be relevant to somebody else.
So is the idea that whether or not you judge something to be an act of remembering might depend on whether or not you take it to be relevant to a particular situation?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So, and is the idea that might be a good thing?
I mean, it could be a harm, or it could work in some ways, and I guess because, I don't know, what I remember to be relevant may not be useful for a particular reason, and vice versa.
So, I mean, relevance is coming into part of my thinking right now. So I'm trying to work on like the positive bit of this, where I say like, how should we conceptualize remembering in order to try and remove some of this injustice? One thing I'm considering is that we should be classifying as acts of remembering only those recollections where the sort of justice relevant information is accurate. So like whether or not Christine Blasey Ford was like taken home by like one person or another from that party isn't really relevant to whether or not she was assaulted. And it seems like in the case, the football fight case, it is really relevant to justice whether or not Matt was aggressive as opposed to like protecting his father. So I think whether or not the relevant information, the information that's relevant to justice is accurate could be really important to whether or not we classify an act of recollection as remembering.
And I had a second question. It was a bit more about posterity. So like we do this retrospectively, like looking back on the past and looking at, okay, how I deemed this authority figure to be maybe, let me think about what I want to say. Is this something that could be done proactively?
Mm-hmm.
And how could we do that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess like in the stereotyping case, like the obvious thing is like challenge stereotypes, right? But obviously that's also not easy to do. So there are certain things ways you can change the environment in which people like form memories and recall things so too. So if we don't look at the criminal case, but we look at the human resources case, for example, so say, decisions about whether or not to promote people are made by a specific panel of people. So you might think that there could be a situation where those decisions are not going well. So people with certain identities are more likely to be promoted than others, and there's a sense that there's an unfairness going on. So if there is that sense of unfairness, there are things that you could do to change the environment in the workplace. So you could try and reduce the stress everyone's experiencing, because it seems like, working under conditions of high cognitive load, processing a lot of information, where things are just tense, more likely to lead people to engage in stereotyping, including storing information in a stereotypical way. So you might think that, get those stress risk assessments done, try and work in the culture and the environment in a workplace, and that can reduce these sorts of effects. But also you've got people at a later point making a decision about whether or not someone is promoted. And at that point, they are thinking back, how has this person behaved in the workplace? They're using their memory to form recollections. You could work on that environment being friendly to people, making less biased memories too. So it's those sorts of changes to environments that I think could help. There's more to be said, I think, but
Thank you.
So I might not have understood you, but it seemed to me that you were saying something like not just getting remembering things wrong or misremembering things can cause injustice, but that there's actually false memories are intrinsically unjust. And I just wondered, can you say a bit more about this framework? Because somebody might say, well, if you believe that A punched B first, that's an unjust, and they didn't. That's unjust not because it's a false memory, but because on the back of the alleged fact that didn't take place rides an accusation that it was your fault that the fight started. Whereas if I misremember somebody's address and go to a party at number 53 rather than number 55, kind of no injustice results because it's just a trivial fact. So why is the injustice intrinsic to the memory rather than intrinsic to the thing that whether somebody did a bad thing or not?
So the whether somebody did the bad thing or not is the impact of the memory on someone else.
Well, it's the relevance of the fact, the relevance of the falsehood that you take to be true because your memory is deceiving you to some further proposition, because it implies fault, for example, and fault didn't lie with that person. So it's not a causal consequence, it's implication.
Yeah, I mean, I think potentially that's unjust too, but I think if you're in a situation where you've behaved really nicely and thoughtfully, you've expressed your agency and autonomy to do the right thing, and someone recalls you as having done something really wrong, failing to actually really reflect what you did because they're stereotyping you, then that in and of itself is wrong to you. And I think conceptualizing it in that way gets to people's experiences of injustice in those sorts of situations. So the implication that might follow from them remembering your behaviour in that sort of way can bring harm, but I think the thing in itself can also be and is unjust. I also do take a sort of pragmatic approach to this. I think that it's important and valuable to point towards these things, say that there's an injustice here, and then calling the memory itself unjust is useful because it's pointing towards a thing that requires attention and fixing, and so using this sort of terminology is useful. So I also do think, of course, it's really important to notice that harms can follow as a result of the intrinsically wrong memory. But I'm kind of a pluralist about this sort of thing. There can be wrongs that are part of the memory, but also wrongs that follow from the memory too.
I guess we could worry about what the kind of primary content of the memory is, because if someone says, well, you committed an injustice against so-and-so, we can always follow up and say, well, why? What did the injustice consist in? And so what I mean by the primary content of the memory is, do I remember that you insulted him, or do I remember that you said such and such a word? And if the content of my memory is you insulted him, I can say, well, all right, what did the insult consist in? And you say, well, in saying such and such. And if that's false, then the injustice consisted not in the fact that you misremembered the utterance of a word, but rather that in that context, the utterance of that word would constitute an insult. I guess that's what I mean by trying to carve off the injustice from the misremembering. So if what you misremember is the utterance of that particular word, until we can explain why uttering that word in that situation was an insult, we haven't yet explained why misremembering is committing an injustice against somebody. It's only once we explain why in that situation saying the word was an insult that you've sort of put your finger on where the injustice lies.
I think it's interesting that you've switched to talking about how we explain the injustice as opposed to the injustice. So I think that it might be that saying, based on your recollection, this person said that word, that can be unjust, even if to properly explain it, you need to like take a step back and say, oh, well, that's unjust because that thing is insulting in this context. So yeah, the explanation, I think, needs to be distinguished from the actual injustice. And if you do that, then it's still the memory that's doing the unjust stuff.
So I have a question about like the categorization of like memories as unjust. I'm thinking like, because like most of the examples that you've gave, I think are quite valid, but I'm wondering like, are they based upon the intrinsic nature of the memory, or is it because we are acting upon certain inaccurate memories? Because like, for say, like I may have some sort of memory from my childhood that are unjust. There may be some stereotypes within it, but then I can't actively remember them right now. Neither may they, and like obviously there are some perhaps like subconscious effects on my behavior, but there is also likelihood that they don't. And in those cases, then the memories themselves may contain some sort of like negative discrimination. But then it seems to be a stretch if I am to say these memories that are not affecting how I am interacting with others to be unjust.
Okay, yeah, okay. I like that question. So, I mean, what I'm going to do, I suppose, is just appeal to, dispositions. That if that memory is such that it could influence how you behave towards people, what you say or what you think, then I would say that labelling it as unjust is a worthwhile enterprise. If it's the sort of thing that you're never going to access and it's never going to influence your thought or action, then labelling it as unjust probably isn't a worthwhile project. And probably, I mean, it might have been unjust if earlier you thought a thought and that was stored in your memory. That might have been an unjust sort of way of thinking, but unless it's going to just like influence how you behave or think, then I don't think I would say it was unjust. But I haven't thought of this before, so I would have to think about it some more to decide whether or not in the long term I agree with that.
I have a quick follow-up on that question, which is like, let's say if we do have this sort of memory that is unjust and we are acting upon it, but let's say if I have some sort of inaccurate memory of the football match on grounds of discrimination, but then when I make a claim on the grounds of this memory, in which like I am acting on this unjust memory, but I also add a claim that I may acknowledge that I have some sort of like cognitive, it's called cognitive incompetencies in that sense, like that would affect my accuracy. So I acknowledge there is some sort of inaccuracy, but I can't really say what inaccuracy it is because like what I remember remains the unjust like memories. Then how might that perhaps compensate the issue of like the injustice of the memory?
Yeah, so it might make the memory less unjust, or your situation as a whole, your cognitive situation less unjust. I'm inclined to still say that the memory though is unjust and that you've just got a framing of the memory that is less unjust or not unjust. And that in that sort of situation, it's actually really important to recognise that the memory is unjust and to adopt that sort of sceptical attitude towards it. So not treat it as an act of remembering, treat it as something that's actually fairly likely to be an unjust memory, and then like either like suspend judgment. This is, I don't know how many of you here are familiar with your Miranda Fricker, but I'm very much appealing to Fricker here. So Fricker talks about how like you, in a situation where you think your judgment might be influenced by prejudice, you can like suspend judgment or you can like shift your judgment in various ways. I think that this is a situation where if you think that your memory is being influenced by this sort of discriminatory thought, then what you should do is treat it appropriately, treat it as potentially unjust, and therefore and modify your actions in accordance with that.
Thank you so much. I have a question about, I guess, the idea of the personal prejudice that we give ourselves. And so the repeating, let's say Matt has a leniency to be a bit more aggressive, but not because of his socioeconomic standards, but rather because of like his upbringing or things like that. Would then the assessment of him
being the aggressor be just, or would it be unjust based on those sort of metrics, if that makes sense?
Yeah. I think maybe in that sort of case, you might have to locate the injustice elsewhere. So to say that the memory isn't unjust, because I guess I need details. So is the idea that a person has generalized about Matt's behavior, that Matt is aggressive because Matt has been aggressive in various instances in the past?
So let's say, like, for example, it's been taken to the courts. For example, maybe someone's been injured or like a civil dispute, and it has been found he maybe has a record, or maybe there is like something that shows that not necessarily because of his socioeconomic background, but rather because of a repeating sort of behavior pattern. Would that then be seen as, oh, that sort of assumption is fair or is just, or would it still be an unjust assessment of Matt?
Yeah. So, yeah, I guess I could go two ways on this one. So you might want to say that the memory is not unjust, that the memory there is just like any sort of memory we might have of someone's behaviour when we assume that they're going to behave like they have done before, and so we misremember what they've done. And described like that, it doesn't seem to be unjust. And what you could do then in that sort of situation is attribute the injustice to the background situation that causes the behaviour, but say the memory itself is not unjust. It could be still like a false memory, but it wouldn't be unjust. But maybe I could be persuaded that there's sufficient similarities to the case where it's based on social identity, that there's prejudice in the background there, that society is prejudiced and that's causing the behaviour and therefore the recollection that is false. I think I'm more inclined to the first option, but thanks for raising it.
Thank you for answering. Thank you.
Let's thank Kathy for a very interesting paper.